What I want to talk about today is what is sacred. And to me, what sacred means is anything that evokes awe. And awe is a very distinctive thing that tells us we are part of something bigger. And it invokes wonder in our heart and it transforms us. And we realize this is something worthy of reference. This is where I was just about 3 weeks ago. I was at Delicate Arch and spent a week in Arches and the vicinity. And we love nature for this. Few things can stimulate us in the same way. I would urge you to go to YouTube and look for waterfall displays. This is an old film clip when Jane Goodall, as a young woman, took her chimps to this waterfall near Gombe. And they literally uh, became quiet and then aroused. They jumped in the pools, they threw rocks, and then they would sit and meditate, it looked like. And she said they were responding to the awe and decided that this could be an incipient form of religion. And I think awe is where it starts because that sense that there is something bigger. So what is sacred? And that's what I want to spend most of today on. Anything that when contemplated transforms us, fills us with a sense of transcendence and indicates we are part of something larger than ourselves, whatever that is. Now, there are lots of scientists and thinkers who look at how humans evolve socially. And some of you who are in my Neanderthal class will remember this, but bands, little extended families eventually became tribes. And this is how we spent 99% of our history. Think of that. 99% has been tribal. And that means probably animistic in our belief system. And not till chiefdoms and states. I know this is a misleading name because you think, oh, well, Indians had chiefs, but they were not the same as a sort of emperor or something like that. And then ultimately states, which demanded obedience to a head, and that meant that monotheistic religions became predominant. So if we can classify Native American religions, it would be animistic. And animism meant that everything in nature was endowed with some wonder, some mystery, some spirit, and that you could join this if you behaved in a certain correct manner and did prayers and offerings and honored. So this was an important aspect, right behavior. If you hunted buffalo, you prayed to them and you made offerings before you hunted them. When you killed them, you then fed them ritualistically, and you even respected the carcass afterwards. Native Inuit would return every piece of the carcass to the ocean. Some friends sent these pictures about a couple of elephants that were electrocuted in a village in India. And the outpouring was amazing. People came out, talked to it, petted it, and gave it offerings and symbolic food. Yes, Ganesh is one of the great Hindu gods, but people acting that way to dead animals shows this animism still in action. When you combine awe with the sublime and this admiration of the vastness, you become transcendent. And one of the things that that leads to is this sense of interconnectedness. And we're all seeking this, especially now since everything is so separate and we don't have that normal human interaction. We seek the sublime. And the sublime refers to this vastness that tells us we also can have this power and this connection. There is a new sort of science. I don't go along with all their precepts, but it looks at how the brain responds to experiencing beauty in art, and also how it creates art. And we know that there's an area, the pre-medial, right, the center frontal cortex, that responds to this sense of beauty. And they do lots of MRIs. What I object to is they sometimes end up trying to map things like sad beauty. I'm not sure what that means, but they think they can actually tell when a person is looking at Monet versus Picasso, and that to me is stretching it. But nonetheless, the brain reacts in a positive way to beauty, and many of us seek that because it's the only time we can activate those parts of our brain, especially the medial frontal. Studies done here in Utah about Mormons meditating in a form of prayer called feeling the spirit, and they get similar areas lighting up in their brain, and they get a very profound sense of pleasure and also purpose. And to me, pleasure and purpose is so rewarding, and we tend to think of that as religion. So awe and the sublime help us connect. Now, there is no single Native American religion. There were over 175 languages originally spoken, so there's probably as many religious belief systems. Most of these languages, or a lot of these languages, are dying or gone already. So what I will be talking about is the real sacredness that seems to be common through all of them. The sacredness of the Great Spirit, which is often, you hear almost like a cliche, but most natives would translate it as the great, or the wonderful mystery, and not necessarily the great, but wonderful. It's amazing to behold. And names have been given to these spirits, Wankantanka or Manitou. And the cosmos should not be unfamiliar. It's really a three-tiered kind of cosmos. There is an underworld, and most sense that the underworld is actually water, held up by water, simply because people have talked about the ocean at the edge of the land. And then there are creatures in the underworld, but many of the spirits are in the sky world, and there's often an axis mundi, or a giant tree of life that connects these two. And this is not too far off something that would be considered part of the Judeo-Christian cosmic view. Not surprisingly, mountains are very spiritual places, simply because they're the closest to the sky, and the sky comes down and envelops them in clouds. So in New England, Mount Katahdin, or Mount Marcy, New York, Monadnock in New Hampshire, all of these were very profound places. And there was a great spirit, the Thunderbird, lived in these mountains. And Thunderbird is one of the few spirits that's almost universal across Native traditions and always associated with mountains. And when it beat its wings, it thundered, and when it was flying, it had lightning. Here in the Southwest, mountains hold the Kachina spirits, and in fact, one major mountain, Mount Kachina, north of Flagstaff. And in the spring, they come out of the mountain, march, and then begin to bring the clouds to the mesas and bring rain, and things will grow and flower. So Kachina, and this is the long-haired Kachina who brings the rain. And sometimes they evoke these by making offerings, and maybe in an altar. We don't always know what these petroglyphs mean, but in this case, they're obviously Kachinas. These Kachinas are actually, these little models are used to teach the children about all the different kinds, and as well as induct children into a particular Kachina clan. I just want to mention Durkheim, who was very important in outlining some of the ways we think about the sacred and also the profane, but sacred being very controlled by rituals and also feelings and symbols. And religions are broader than any god or spirit, so it cannot be defined, as he says, exclusively in these terms. There's also the profane world, the everyday quotidian world that some special people, everyone in the Native American traditions can cross over into the sacred world sometime or other. There are sort of professionals who have various abilities to transcend and enter this sacred world at will, and they are often healers or shaman. There are many terms for this pervading spirit, and it's most often referred to as that wonderful feeling when you have that connection. The Navajos have a term, hosho, that is the beauty way, and there's rituals for the beauty way. And being of good will and practicing good behavior allows you to walk the beauty way. When you know what is right and good, it will remind you of swaying with the drums, and you will scatter peace like corn pollen. So what constitutes the sacred? You may notice this is an ongoing problem. Devil's Tower, which I was visiting recently, climbers and campers and everything else, yet this is a sacred mountain to these people. And you will find prayer bundles all over the place. So this is a place where emergence occurred, the birthplace of heroes, places that inspire and provide access to medicine. So all of these are sacred. And how do you access it? Well, like all religions, there are many different ways, but Native Americans do it with things that you wouldn't think about. Games. Games become quite serious and evoking spiritual powers. Healing, dances. Dancing is very serious. Prayers, offerings, ceremonies, rituals. The vision quest, which is a part that became adopted by the New Age. A young man or woman, often before puberty, will seek out a shaman or a guide and say, where should I go? What should I do? You usually go somewhere isolated, you dig a hole, or there's a cave or a mountaintop, you fast, you sleep very little, and you eventually hope you will be visited and have this dream that you come back with and interpret with the help of your shaman or spirit guide. Sometimes these things are still found. These little isolated places, sometimes the dream will be interpreted by, or at least remembered by, a petroglyph. So these are often used over and over again because they are powerful. This is one of the most dramatic places, and if you don't make a spiritual connection here, you probably are beyond hope. This is a secret place, let's just call it that, in Arches. Medicine Bluff in Oklahoma, which comes out of the prairies in a very dramatic way. And you can see all the prairies around it. This has long been a place of vision seeking and seeking medicine guides and spirits. Agawa Rock, an island in Lake Superior, very potent place and filled with petroglyphs. This is actually probably the horned serpent that eventually the native thunderbird has to fight. We're not always sure what these visions mean, but they meant something to the person seeking them. Badger 2 Medicine, a place in Flathead National Forest, a very powerful place that people traditionally go. Shiprock, and I could go on, but there are places even in California that we'll talk about later. In this course, I'm sort of going to just talk about the sacred today and then focus in. The next time we'll focus in on the East and the Midwest, in particular the Mississippi Valley, which may not seem like a particular sacred place to us today, but it was the center of many powerful kind of cultural developments. And then I'll talk about the West and then the far West. One of the visions you hope to have is a visitation by an animal spirit, and this would probably become your spirit guide. And so you would maybe tattoo yourself with this. You would develop a special reverence with this animal, or even something else like a rock. This is a great vision quest by the incredible Algonquin artist Norvel Morceau. It's hard to interpret, but if you look, this may actually been a place where he sought his vision, a little tiny hut, and he may have had rocks, hot rocks, and he may have done a sweat bath in here. But eventually you get your spirit guide and you get an additional source of energy and understanding. And you add to this slowly as you go along by having a medicine bundle that you carry, especially when you're traveling. And these bundles are often very ornate, and they may just be filled with things that you have found, things that you were shown, a little turtle shell, rocks, a little fetish. And these are very powerful things because these spirits also are able to cure you. So medicine is synonymous with spirit. And medicine bundles will often have pieces of plants, roots, feathers, and these are among the most sought after, sadly, collectibles. Traditionally, the medicine bundle would have something from a plant, sweetgrass or cedar, something from animal, often talons or feathers or teeth, some stone, and then something from the human world, a carved fetish, maybe not even carved, but just a symbolic thing. And people carried this, and more importantly, each clan had a clan medicine bundle. And this is beautifully described in Alice Marriott's The 10 Grandmothers, because the clan bundle was called the grandmother. And these were hundreds of years old, and people remembered the significance through oral communication of each item in the clan bundle. Medicine shields also were thought to hold this medicine. And in fact, if you had one, it would protect you from your enemies' arrows or spears. This beautiful one down here was stolen in 1970 from the Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. Someone was on the lookout and found it for auction in Paris, and immediately got the diplomatic service and other people together, and it was reclaimed and brought back in 2019. So it was gone for 50 years from the tribe, and it was a sacred shield. Offerings, prayers, many of these entailed tobacco or sage or other sorts of things. Tobacco is a native plant to North America, and it may have been addictive, but I tell you, it's very powerful, it's very potent, and it is used very sparingly as prayers and as spiritual ceremonies. So it often will be wrapped up, and these will be tied often in a bundle or something to invoke a spirit. If you're going hunting, you would also leave food here for the deer or the antelope, whatever you were after. Sweetgrass is always used. It doesn't grow in California, But I always, I have friends who talk about sweetgrass as my sister, because sweetgrass takes care of them. And it makes you feel more human if you wear a little bracelet of this. And you often trade it and so on. So here is Devil's Tower and prayer flags all over the place. You'll find them on tops of mountains. It's interesting, the same sort of thing happens in Tibet. This is going to be the central tree in what is called the sun dance. They will dance around this central tree, which is decorated with prayers, and dance for 4 days, often 4 days continuously. Sometimes they just tie a feather or two and a flag so that the prayer will be picked up by the wind and taken all over the world. Corn pollen, which is a very crucial sacred element. It has to be sanctified, but then once it's sanctified, it will be used to bless. Part of the blessing, it's sprinkled on an infant when it's first born, sprinkled on a hunter, sprinkled on a woman undergoing puberty rites, and so on. Where do these things take place? Well, many of these are sanctified by particular places. One of the sad interpretations of English law, Native Americans will look at a mountain like Navajo Mountain and call it a sacred mountain. But then the judge will say, well, if this is your sacred mountain, where is the church? And they will respond, the whole thing is our church. Well, you don't have an edifice. So Native Americans lose out all the time when trying to reclaim sacred areas, because we are putting a sort of monotheistic, materialistic aspect on what they believe. A shaking tent. This was just a small series of twigs bent over, willow twigs, and then wrapped in bark or reeds. And the person entered it and may have just fasted and chanted and danced. Chanting is a very easy way of inducing trance. Drumming, and their friends would be outside if they needed water or something, and eventually your spirit would visit you. So this was a part of the vision quest for lots of Eastern Indians who may not have access to some mountaintops or austere deserts. Another similar aspect was the sweat lodge. And this is mostly Western, but you'll find it in other situations. Willow twigs bent, making a wattle, and then dirt piled up on top of it, or maybe a couple of animal hides. And then you burned, put rocks in the fire until they got scalding hot. You carried them in carefully with a tong, a branch tong, and then you doused it with water after you've closed yourself in. And you would chant and beat yourself with sage and pray and keep going till you barely could stand up. Or you couldn't stand up because most of these you had to kneel in. This also got co-opted by the New Agers and so on. But you will still see these. Families and tribes will have these and carefully take care of them. You see the water for dousing the rocks. And there's a similar one that's still practiced. These are Eastern Indian longhouses, Iroquois, and so on, Algonquin longhouses. And sometimes there would be a mass healing and a mass praying, which would involve emetic plants that were drumming, dancing, and so on. This was called the Midawinwin. In the West, a very holy type of structure is the kiva. It's a circular structure built into the ground, maybe with adobe or carved into the ground with an entrance in the roof. And then a few other aspects about this. There'll be a fire in the center, a little ventilation tunnel, benches around the outside, and a place for grinding. People would live in these, but it also, some of these would be simple sort of ritualistic centers. And there always is a hole, and this is the Sipapu, which was the original place that Navajo and Hopi came onto the earth itself. Many of these would be kept as an altar with kachinas, with herbs, with skulls of animals, offerings, olas filled with certain offerings, feathers, all sorts of things. And of course, we will talk later about Chaco in New Mexico, which was probably a city of kivas. You see all these kivas surrounding this central plaza. These were probably all different clan religious centers. And this was also probably a major trading center. What rituals were practiced in these places? Of course, storytelling. This is how traditions pass in an oral society. Dancing, smoking, singing, smudging, all of these things in the vision quest. Dancing is so potent and linked to particular seasonal or activities. These are just some of the dances, the Three Sisters, corn, bean, squash, war dances, rain dances, stomp dances. I'll talk about the ghost dance in a minute, but these were really powerful and everyone took part in them. These often went on for days at a time, often nonstop. Again, how much noise you can make. You can see the drumming here. You can see this is a somewhat postmodern because they have bells. And I've seen a lot of tin cans just tied together and then pebbles put inside. Oftentimes, you would show off to your neighbors. And so this actually became called the powwow. And powwows are still held where Indian tribes get together, have contests. You see they each have an individual number. Contests for groups dancing and for individuals dancing, for costumes and so on. But it is a way they can come together, scope out potential brides and trade and so on. Kids are from the get-go are taught these dances and they become quite competitive and they're very, very active in the dance community. One of my favorite dances is the stomp dance, and many traditional villages would have grounds that was built around a tree of life. And this was often kind of a trench created by the feet pounding into the dirt, and it would get dusty and so on. Nowadays, the stomp ground is ritualized because you have the elders watching and you have some shade. You may not have the tree, but you'll have a little bit of a fire. And you make racket. You have rattles and so on. And in this case, this young lady has deer hooves. And you can see some sort of rattle on these. And this is one of the few, almost all over, that spread from the eastern United States. These are Seminoles down here. One of the things that makes the stomp dance very noisy is these little terrapins. These are box turtles, and they're glued shut with pebbles inside. They drill holes in it, and they tie them onto their ankles. And it's a big deal for a little kid to go out there and make as much noise. That's the idea. And the spirits are more likely to hear you. You may imitate what you're trying to placate and honor by dancing like a bear and with bear marks and even claws if you can, or you may honor and placate the buffalo before a hunt. And so you act like them and make sounds like them. One of my favorites is actually acting like the sage grouse, which is a very classic dance. The sage grouse and the lesser sage grouse dances in a very distinctive way. And so the native people just copy that. In the Southwest and in California, there is a very potent deer dance, the Yaqui and Tono Adon. These are in southern Arizona and down into Sonora, Mexico. And they make beautiful masks or headdresses. And then, of course, they have gourd rattles. And notice drums, gourds, rocks, and even flutes to make the music for the dance. Where am I? Right. The Sundance, which is still held and adapted every year. It celebrates the new year, usually around the summer solstice. And it goes on for 4 to 8 days, almost nonstop. And so there's a trading and banquets and all sorts of things. There is a central tree of life, and then it's built around this, and it offers rebirth and it offers renewal to anyone who takes part in it. It also acts as a vision quest, especially among the Plains Indians, because they will build an altar out of bison skulls around this. There's a central tree. They tie axes, and then they have this altar, and then they will dance, but they dance in a very distinctive way that many of them will skewer their skin with a bone and then tie rawhide around the end of the bone and lean back. It's tied to the central tree or central branch, and they will dance until the skin rips and the bone is pulled out. And this literally can go on for days. Like many rituals, it was outlawed by the US government in 1904 and not established again until 1978. Canada did this to a lot of traditions and Native Canadians that they couldn't practice, but this was very powerful. It's still practiced today. And while you're dancing, you make melodies with this eagle bone whistle. And you can see in this case, you may carry the bison skull, or it may just be part of the altar. At almost the demise of Native Americans, Paiute shaman Wavoka developed a dance called the ghost dance. And if people did it for 5 successive nights, all the way to dawn, eventually he hoped the white people would disappear. Also, if you wore a sacred white tunic, you would be protected from the bullets. It likewise was outlawed by the BIA in 1890 for fear of uniting the tribes. And near that uprising, General Forsyth sent 500 troops after a Sioux tribe that were going to have a ghost dance. And one of their leaders was shot accidentally. And while the 500 surrounded the Sioux encampment, an accidental shot, who knows who fired it, but cannons and Gatling guns and 500 rifles shot and killed 300 men, women, and children at Wounded Knee. Americans don't know about this, but this is one of the greatest genocides that Native people have ever suffered. The Native people like to show the 2 pictures that look exactly like Nazi assassinations, because these were all men, women, and children killed. In many respects, this is called a massacre, but I'm not sure this is a proper word to use. If you go to the site, this is Wounded Knee today, and this is why it's so important. They will never forget this massacre. And you see all the prayer flags and flowers around it. This is Bigfoot's grave. As I said, storytelling are really, really important. This is how everyone learns and reinforces drumming, and the kids start very, very early and form a circle. And native flutes, which are very intricate, very beautiful, and sacred. So playing the flute itself is a sacred act, and so you will decorate yourself according to your guide, spirit, and so on. These are Apaches and Comanches smudging with sage, sweetgrass, all sorts of things, cedar, and saying prayers so that you may be cleansed. And the sacramental smoking is also part of cleansing, and other kinds of prayers, offerings. Sand paintings are major offerings because they take so much time and patience and care to produce. And sometimes animal skins and hides are painted to remember an event or to teach others. There are rites of passage, birth, naming, the first kill or counting coup. If you were a really good warrior, you would ride into an enemy's camp and just touch them with a circular stick. And that meant I could kill you, but I'm not going to. And that's called counting coup. Puberty rites, marriage rites, death rites. Every tribe has a slightly different sequence of rituals. This is puberty rites for the Navajo, very involved, 4 nights and entailing how the hair is fixed, women grinding corn, the young girl making cornbread, burying in this, running and chasing other young girls. It's very involved. Also, menstrual huts, which are somewhat universal. That is, if you're in your menses, you announce this to the community and go off with your sisters and so on into a special hut until the menses passes, because you could pollute the hunters and spoil the hunt with your presence or your odors or other things like this. This is sort of a universal tradition, menstrual huts. When the baby is born, there's lots of things done, washing with water, taking it out and showing it the rising sun. But you take the umbilicis and you make a beautiful fetish, and then you tie the fetish onto their papoose, onto the backboard. You see there's one and there's one. And these are very, very beautiful and very intricate, and they're kept for a long, long time. Highly prized, unfortunately, by collectors. So Wakantanka, one of the things, he had 4 major spirits who helped him and infiltrated the world. And these 4 were all broken down to 16 other spirits to help you. And Manitou. And Manitou is supposedly from this island up in Lake Superior in Ontario. Manitou Island is remarkable. All kinds of geologic formations that are very dramatic that supposedly held the spirit. They would honor them not necessarily by petroglyphs, but by petroforms. They would make shapes of the spirits or the spirit guides. So there would be turtle shapes and so on. And this was very common in the Northeast. Without cliffs, you would just make the spirit shape with rocks or draw things on hides. This is in Manitou National Park, actually in Ontario. And I want to tell you one quick story. And this is about Adahensik. And Adahensik was a woman who lived in the sky. And there are many, many versions that are found all over northeastern and northeastern United States. But she was a sky person, very beautiful. And her father wanted to show her what was below the sky. So he pulled up the great tree of life, and she looked down, and it was very mysterious. She couldn't quite see it. Uh, and depending on the version, either she slipped or he pushed her or her husband pushed her. But she fell, and she fell down from the sky, and she saw these things circling her, and eventually they caught her and lifted her, geese and swans, and they lifted her and landed her on this rock, which turned out to be a turtle. And she immediately said, well, I have, when I was falling, I grabbed for the grass and flowers and seeds. So I have all these seeds. If we had earth, we could plant them. And so Beaver dove in the water and tried to get to the bottom. And in some cases, he did. In some cases, it was pie-billed grebe. And he went all the way to the bottom of the ocean, came back with a little bit of mud on his beak. And even today, he carries the remnants of that mud. And they spread the mud on the back of Turtle's shell. And that became Turtle Island. That became North America. In some cases, it was the toad who went down and came up with a mouthful of mud. So the story's still the same, but it varies. She spread the mud on the turtle's back, grew the plants, and she gave birth to Earth Mother, who planted corn and other things. And Earth Mother gave birth to twins. And this is a very common trope in creation myths. One of the twins was good and one was evil. One was evil and hard as flint, and so they still call him Flint. And anything good that the good brother did, evil would reverse. So if he made the rivers flow toward the sea, the evil brother would make the rivers flow both ways at once. Eventually, the evil brother was cast off to the underworld. Very, very common. And if you think, here's Cain and Abel, and here's Glooskap, who's also a big spirit who had to fight his brother Malam and eventually defeated him. And Ayoshika, who had to fight his twin brother. So this is very common. And even in Aztec, the Popovlu, the twin brothers fight until one is victorious. And I'll quickly finish with the Thunderbird. And Thunderbird, for most of the New England people, came from Mount Katahdin in Maine, which is still a sacred mountain. And Thoreau visited this, and it scared him. It was probably the wildest place he ever visited, and he never went back. So the Thunderbird was born on Mount Katahdin. When it flies, lightning would come off of its wingtips, and when it beat the wings, it would have thunder. And Thunderbird was liberated to save the world from the horned serpent. Now, this is a pictograph up in Lake Superior, but these things, which look very Mayan, are actually found in New England. And eventually Thunderbird came down and fought the horned serpent and freed the world of this. And think about that, you know, who's in the Garden of Eden? A serpent. It's always a serpent who gets the bad rap. Anyway, and if you think about the Mayan traditions, here are the two twins, and here's the turtle. Interesting. And very sacred turtles throughout Mayan. And even if you want to go to the Hindus, the earth is held on the back of elephants who are riding on the back of a giant turtle. So commonalities, who knows where these came from? I know this is a lot to digest and a lot to think about, especially the cosmos. You can see the horned serpents down here. You can see the thunderbird. You can see the dead rising. Interesting thing to process. Next time, we'll talk about some of the more distinctive sacred sites in the East, all the way from Florida up to New England, and then the Midwest, from the Great Lakes down to uh, Louisiana and Mississippi, and about one of the greatest unknown civilizations that have ever existed anywhere, and that is the great mound culture of the Americas, which was short-lived but very, very important, and is still a place I think people need to know about. So I think with that, we can go, Michelle, to some questions.
Before I moved here, which was about 6 months ago,
Oh, welcome.
thank you, somewhere in my learning about the area, there was a mention of petroglyphs in Monterey County, and I can't find anything about that since then, and so I'm starting to wonder where that came from, and I'm curious if you can talk about that.
The ones in Monterey County are very, very secreted, and sometimes and often on private land. There are a fair number along the coast, uh, and probably the best one, and their pictographs are actually in the Chumash uh, cave of hands down in San Luis Obispo County. The other spot, which is this great rock in the middle of the Carrizo Plain, um, which is studded with all kinds of petroglyphs. The Carrizo Plains are a national monument, and the rock has been fenced off, and access to it is kind of strictly regulated. You almost have to have a tour, and they don't always open it during the summer season because it's too hot. So I think it might be gonna be opening soon. You can go on their website and make a trip down there. It's great if you go down in the spring because the Carrizo Plain, which is sort of southeast of Paso Robles, is an amazing place for wildflowers. And the rock is just off the edge of the plain. Uh, the other thing is that a good part of Monterey County and San Benito County is Fort Roberts, or Camp Roberts. And that is controlled by the National Guard, the US military. And sometimes you're allowed on, sometimes they'll do tours, but most of the petroglyphs in Monterey are on Camp Roberts. And so strictly controlled, access is strictly controlled.
I'm glad to hear they're being protected.
Yes, boy, having spent almost a month and a half going around the Southwest, visiting places that I know well, seeing how much vandalism there is,
Yeah.
it is really disheartening. The coastal region, for various reasons, do not have as many petroglyphs, and even the Sierra Nevada, which is sort of lacking in a lot of those. But one of the greatest sites throughout the United States is actually in the middle, or in the Mojave Desert, outside of Baja, is also a very, very rich place where there's almost no protection, but a place called the Coso Mountains and the Coso Washes, but it too is on China Lake Naval Weapons testing site. So it is completely protected, but every once in a while, if you check the Matarongo Valley Museum in Ridgecrest, they have organized tours onto these sites. They limit the number. You have to show up quite early in Ridgecrest. You have to go through a pre-orientation, and then they take you up to these sites and walk you through them. Unfortunately, even with that, some people have vandalized them, although it may not have, probably not have been the museum visitors. There are a lot of people on that base. So that is one of the most stirring places to visit that I know. And I was just there about a year ago with a group.
Roger, my wife and I are originally from Ohio, and my parents took us on tours of the mounds in southern Ohio,
Yeah,
the Serpent Mound and the
yes,
Mound City Group. I don't know if you are familiar with those, but I'd be interested in hearing what you say about those. It can be next week.
it will be next week. Yes, uh, especially the Serpent Mound, and because many of these mounds have astronomical relevance, and there are still quite mysterious Cahokia, uh, but all of the mounds, they range from New York to Louisiana, Georgia to Ohio to all the way up to Illinois and elsewhere. Uh, Pyramids, the highest concentration of pyramids anywhere is in the United States. So, and that alone comes as a shock. And they're more recent than Egyptian pyramids, but they are in some cases as massive. And their connection with the Mayan traditions is still not clear. But when you see the artifacts that come out of it and you hear about the supposed practices, it's very, very much like Mayan tradition. And it's not far-fetched. The parrots have been found in these areas, and other things that are of Central American origin, that is either carvings or actual animals. And the same in Chaco. Chaco traded turquoise down into Central America and brought up parrots and other sorts of things. Yes, that is a very important part of next week.
As I was looking at the slides you showed around sacred places, some of why a place is sacred becomes pretty obvious. It could be its geography, it could be its height, for example.
Yes.
But other places seem to be like my garden or like anybody's garden. So, what imbues sacredness to a place? What makes a place sacred?
In part, the feeling that you get from being there, but that is couched in your understanding of the place. If the place was a birthplace for some great spirit, then you will feel differently about your garden. But yes, I agree. Many of them seem quotidian, but there are backstories to all of these. And many of them, sadly, we'll never know. They were plowed under, they were dug up, they were just vandalized. So we will never know what the stories were. And springs and waterfalls, all of these places were very powerful to these people, but we've turned them into tourist attractions or other sorts of things. But I agree. But they would say, well, your garden should be a sacred place, because it is. All the life force that's going through the roots and coming out and so on. Yes, I would agree that your garden is sacred.